President Biden just signed, and Juneteenth is now an official federal holiday. What are your thoughts? That I already got an email from work saying they aren't paying extra for that day. In the same email they went on about how they care about diversity, but that this holiday doesn't count for extra pay. Haha. Good old non-profits always focused on making a profit. Disconnected lip service. I know. Americans have been pushing to have Election Day declared a federal holiday for decades, to no avail. Now, in the midst of voter suppression laws and ever-increasing work hours and measures to complicate the process at the polls for minorities especially, the current administration decides that Juneteenth, which should be a federal holiday, albeit maybe not before Election Day, is the priority. It's the literal band-aid on a bullet wound behavior that further displays that our government has no clue what needs to be done to support its citizens and move forward. Also, if our government really wants to support its black citizens, all it needs to do is listen to the messages of last year's protests. Less police, more community funding. Yes, this is a big step in the direction of recognizing that Black Lives Matter, but without taking the actual efforts and measures that need to be taken to actually improve Black lives. This is a publicity stunt, at best. I've seen articles that describe it as a national observed holiday and some that describe it as a federal holiday. I've thought that Fed means that everyone gets off, and that means that employers can choose to offer it as a holiday. So, which one is it? Haven't heard a peep from my HR department. So I'm confused. Is Juneteenth also known as Emancipation Day? A week before the national holiday announcement, I was unable to get an appointment for my parakeet to get her beak and nails trimmed because the vet's office is closed for the full weekend due to what they called Emancipation Day. To my knowledge, that's something that takes place in April. I don't get it. Which is it? Hey, it's pretty rad. I tend to lean a bit more right than a good few of my friends, and I heard a lot of people on this side of the aisle get real suspicious and seeing the Juneteenth holiday as another foothold to tear down the country down from or something, but I personally just don't agree. Slavery ending in the United States was an incredible thing, and word of its end reaching the edges of this nation is pretty rad. Abolishing the institution of slavery once and for all was a radical idea back then, and many died to see that reality come to be. A little remembrance and a thoughtful moment spent reflecting on how the country carved its own cancerous, inhumane practice out of itself through a brutal civil war, sounds like something we could spare a day for. No, there's loads of debates and fights to be had, but I see this as a pretty inoffensive good. My thoughts? Are you sure? I know you asked, but I can be a bit gruff with my opinion. Okay, but remember, you asked. 99.9% of U.S. companies won't officially accept it as a holiday for time off for their employees. The typical 5 we get is already a major burden on them to give us. The 0.1% of companies that do give it off to their employees will brag about it, likely 5 years before they sell out the company to the above group and screw every employee over with the decision. As for me, I feel working in the private sector is just not worth it anymore. Our PTO time is either cut, combined, or abused by companies who require us to take their allotment to honor these holidays is just absurd. I'm a veteran of the United States Navy, who served in Desert Storm, and not even I can have Veterans Day off. How fucking callous is that? Nothing says thank you for your service than you'll need to take PTO. Vet, the higher pay position is no longer true anymore, with insurance costs now eating a significant portion of our income, and don't let the pre-tax bullshit pretend it's helpful. It's not, as well as outside costs exploding. It's just atrocious. I wish I could have a government job right now, honestly. Even if my pay isn't great, I'd get every federal holiday off, a guaranteed pension, lower healthcare costs, and I know what my pay will always be since it's required to post the salary. I'm on the lower level, so maybe my thoughts are as articulated as yours. I will let be on a little secret. Outside our borders there is still slavery, yet no one wants to take on that charge. Why? Well, could be the biggest country guilty is China. Why don't we abolish slavery as a nation, and that will show we really do love all. I don't really get it. It's cool that there is a holiday celebrating the end of slavery, but picking the date based on when a group of slaves in one town found out they were free seems completely arbitrary, and buying into the folksy Ebonics-esque name seems patronizing. I'd much rather have Emancipation Day on Sept 22nd, Emancipation Proclamation, or December 5th, ratification of the 13th Amendment. What I am trying to say is, if we do not teach about slavery or the Civil War but have a separate holiday commemorating black freedom, what are you going to tell them they were free from? There is a complete history. Let us remember, America did not invent slavery. We did, though, fight amongst ourselves to free and abolish it from within our borders. I just find it weird how I'm on the lower level, so maybe my thoughts are as articulated as yours. I will let be in on a little secret. Outside our borders there is still slavery, yet no one wants to take on that charge. Why? Well, could be the biggest country guilty is China. Why don't we abolish slavery as a nation, and that will show we really do love all. I just had to look up what Juneteenth is, and I think it's quite nice. I haven't looked into the politics behind it or what people are saying about it. I like the fact that we are recognizing the end of slavery as an important day worthy of remembrance. I think it would be nice if the day was taken off to educate and remember what the holiday is actually about. Again, I am just now reading about this and believe this to be a good thing based on the premise. While I understand the sentiment and this will be translated as a negative comment, it feels like an empty gesture. Martin Luther King Jr. is the only individual to have a federal holiday in the US now. And what did that do? Is the holiday going to stop officers from violating people's rights in their own vehicles and homes? Is it going to keep black unarmed teenagers from getting killed while reacting to something they don't understand is happening? Juneteenth is important to remember, but there are bigger fish to fry. It's not like we celebrated the emancipation before this. I am all for a holiday commemorating the end of slavery, but the folkloric status of Juneteenth is odd. The date of the Emancipation Proclamation or the enactment of the 13th Amendment would be the obvious choices. Juneteenth was simply the day that Gordon Granger reached Galveston, Texas, and issued a local proclamation announcing the end of slavery, just as other federal commanders had been doing for some time as they advanced rapidly through the Confederate hinterlands. Emancipation was a process, not an event. As a practical matter, the Union Army had been harboring and protecting runaway slaves since the beginning of the war. If one wanted to put the emphasis on self-emancipation, and there's a lot to recommend that choice, Ben Butler's invention of the term contraband at Fort Monroe, Virginia is the iconic moment. Butler, who was a much better lawyer than he was a general, stole a march here. He effectively cut the Gordian knot of Washington politics, and, when Lincoln and the Republicans endorsed Butler's order, the Fugitive Slave Act was effectively repealed as a matter of military necessity. From that point forward, Union troops operating in Confederate territory were de facto emancipators with effective legal cover. This process accelerated steadily after the Emancipation Proclamation, although armies that were moving fast often didn't want to be burdened with long tails of runaway slaves who had to be fed and protected. The Emancipation Proclamation, of course, didn't officially end slavery throughout the nation as a matter of law. It merely abolished slavery as a war measure in areas that were in rebellion, that is, across the Confederacy. Lincoln understood that complete legal abolition would require a constitutional amendment. As a practical matter, 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky and Missouri, had refused to secede and fought for the Union, so Lincoln had to be mindful of a delicate political situation. Everyone understood that the Emancipation Proclamation meant the end of slavery if the North won the war, but with 4 slave states in the Union, The I's had to be dotted and the T's had to be crossed. It was of course very useful for Lincoln that Butler was one of the prominent war Democrats. The Northern Democrats were mostly soft war advocates, if they supported the war at all, and were perfectly content to seek a peace that allowed the South to retain slavery. By 1864, the Northern Democrats were heavily copperhead. The South's last chance to retain slavery died with Lincoln's re-election. The endgame was a rolling process. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia, what little was left of it, on April 9. Joe Johnston surrendered the Army of Tennessee, what little was left of it. In North Carolina on April 26, Jefferson Davis was captured on May 10. The last Confederate general to surrender, on June 23, was Stand Watie, who led the Cherokee Confederate contingent. The Cherokee-held slaves had declared for the Confederacy. The CCS Shenandoah was the last Confederate combatant unit to surrender. She had been at sea and did not make port and learn the news until November 6, when she surrendered. Gordon Granger was a fine soldier, and by all means let's put up Juneteenth statues in his honor. But there was nothing especially noteworthy about his reaching Galveston. Somehow folklore has elevated an event that had very little real significance. I'm on contract with the Gov. After the announcement came down that the Gov will be off for the holiday, my company emailed us saying we don't have the holiday in our contractor and it's not paid, so we can't work. We either have to burn PTO or make up the time. Since we have 0 sick days and very little PTO, I opted to make up the hours, working extra hours. Next week is going to suck. I used to be at a job where we did a lot of business with county governments in Texas, and June 19th would surprise us every year with all the county offices being closed. I'm not sure why we're making a state holiday a federal holiday, instead of the better dates of the actual emancipation, but it's good to celebrate something to commemorate the removal of slavery, and I guess June 19th is as good a day as any. It's performative activism, at best. Biden hasn't done anything genuine for the black community, he's just made Juneteenth a national holiday. Woohoo! Good for you. Let's work on making sure that voting rights are clear and defined so these draconian Jim Crow-like restrictions that have been pushed around lately aren't possible. He's playing to his base because Dems love to pretend they're being progressive. I'd like to see him do something real. Also, like a lot of other people have said, make Election Day a national holiday. Easier said than done, but still, Juneteenth being a national holiday is great on paper, but it means nothing in practice. For everyone saying the name is stupid, they call it that because the exact date the slaves in Texas were freed isn't known, but it is known to be somewhere from June 15th to 19th, hence, Juneteenth. Edit. I get that some of all might not like the name, but changing it would be completely disingenuous to the history of the historically black holiday. At the end of the day, it's just a name. This doesn't really count as a thought, only a story. I was a 9-year-old kid riding home with my mom. We lived in a mid-sized town in Miss. There was a gathering in a huge field. It was a gigantic party. They had one thing in common. They were all black. I asked my mom if we could go. She looked at my white face and said, "That party isn't for us." I'll admit I'm very ignorant and naive. I was just always told that the only people who celebrated Juneteenth in the South were black people. I just felt like they were normal people, but the railroad tracks kept the town segregated. They partied on their side on Juneteenth while most others complained. I always wanted to go to one of those parties. I moved to New York and I was confused because everyone here celebrates it. I like how my northern friends are reprogramming me. Again, I have no idea what I'm talking about. It's just a story. Edit. So it seems like it's not really celebrated in a lot of places, and a lot of people have never heard of it either. This is just a guess. but I grew up in an area that was a hotspot for a lot of the terrible things that happened during the civil rights movement. I heard stories of a nearby very small town that is mostly minority violently protesting after Martin Luther King died. I was told that after it happened a gathering of people marched down the highway to protest in town. Apparently it was very violent, but these stories came from a few of the more racist whites in the family who were literally trying to justify segregation. My point is, if you've grown up and lived through a time when these terrible events happened 30 minutes from you, then you probably celebrated more often, but that's just a guess. I'm glad I grew up in this area. The minorities here have taught me a lot. I was in a gas station waiting in line. A large white man was yelling because the debit card machine was down and took it out on all the workers. When he left they all started singing, "I got sunshine on a cloudy day." I love my people. So I feel very strongly pro-Juneteenth. I come from a kind of isolated upper to upper middle class white background in Pennsylvania. I had no idea what Juneteenth was at all until I joined the army and was asked to do Juneteenth parades. We went to Chester, PA, and the image is just stunning to me. We absolutely looked like fish out of water. We're 4 white guys in Chester, which is a really poor, high-crime area, leading a parade of African-American vets. We did successively more turnouts, and it was just really shocking to see all these people celebrating something I had never experienced. You see parades and speeches and parties and all these folks dressed up in church. It was probably from this I realized how segregated our society is. And when I found out about the talk I got really depressed for a while about how fundamentally different, not in detail but in foundational aspects, my experience in America could be from another one of my fellow citizens. So yeah, it's kind of a touch point for me when I went from America's a racist country, everyone has a fair shot, to we've got some problems we should probably do something about. The immediate reaction was that it was virtue signaling on a governmental level, instead of addressing actual problems. They'd take credit for solving the black problem by giving a bunch of white people the day off. But then I realized that I don't care about why they did it. Part of the history of Juneteenth is not just that the slaves were freed, but that nobody told them they were free. The Emancipation Proclamation had been signed years earlier, and the Civil War had been over 4 months. June 19th was the day that Texas, specifically Galveston, was forced to free its slaves. Many of them were not even aware that they had been declared free long before. So it is not only a celebration of freedom, it is an annual reminder that freedom cannot be dismissed or ignored, and it will provide us an annual opportunity to make that argument, in an era when one of the political parties is actively trying to conceal that history, and that's an important accomplishment regardless of the reason. I am really tired of these symbolic gestures instead of real materialistic change. It's always banning plastic straws but not putting a curb on companies creating vast swathes of waste, clapping for essential workers instead of raising minimum wage, painting BLM on sidewalk streets instead of making sure black people have an equal opportunity in the United States and can vote just as easily. From everything I have read, this was really only a big deal in Texas for a long time. I honestly don't see the overarching historical significance to justify this as a holiday instead of the day the Emancipation Proclamation was actually signed, or the day the 13th Amendment was signed. Juneteenth was the day slaves in Texas were told they were freed as a result of the EP. So, I see the importance to Texas. I just feel one of the other days makes more sense for a national holiday. I support the idea, and as a federal employee, I'm never going to say no to another day off, but the execution was not ideal. My agency has tons of contracts in ongoing construction. We are constantly juggling schedules to try and time all sorts of things. By doing this like one day in advance, it's messing up all of our contractors who don't get the day off. I, the federal employee, didn't even hear this was a possibility until yesterday. Many of the contractors didn't know until today, like even 2 weeks would have been enough notice to reduce the impact. So my only issue was the way it was rolled out, which created a bunch of unnecessary chaos.